I've got a backpack here. In it, I've got everything that I've been told that I'm going to need to be prepared for a disaster. I've got a torch. I've got some water, some food. I've got things like ID, bank stuff, insurance stuff, some stuff for the kids, medication, first aid kit. I've been told, we've all been told repeatedly, that this is what we're going to need to be prepared for a disaster, to get through that first 72 hours if something happens. So if I've got my bag and I've prepared, that means I'm prepared for a disaster, right? No. I've been working in disaster recovery for most of my career. I headed up the Australian Red Cross Disaster Recovery Program for more than a decade, and these days I research what people find helpful and unhelpful after disasters. Most of my work has focused on the long and complicated aftermath of disasters. So when I think about disaster preparedness, I'm coming at things from the other side of things. I want to tell you a story today about disaster preparedness and why I don't think we're doing a very good job of it just yet. This is a story about a woman, let's call her Jane, and her kid, let's call them Ollie. Now Jane is sharp, she's resourceful, she's diligent, English is her first language, she's highly literate, she's been working in the same job for 10 years, she's the president of the PTA at Ollie's school. Jane is the sort of person who pays her bills on time, her mortgage on time, her home is fully insured. Now, a disaster is threatening the town that Jane and Ollie live in. It could be a fire or a flood, that bit's not important. What's important is that Jane has been thinking about this for a long time. What with all of the disasters that have been on the news over the last few years, she knows that if something happens to them, it's going to be her job to make sure that Ollie's safe. So Jane has followed all of the preparedness information that she's been given to the letter, the stuff from governments and emergency services. She's downloaded all of the apps. She's planned 3 evacuation routes. She's filled the car with fuel. She's cleaned the gutters. She's secured her home. She's got a box that she's put photos and other important things to her and Ollie in. She's got her bag. She's got all the stuff. She's got Ollie's medication, the torch, the medications, the food, the water, all the things. She's ready. Jane watches the news and she sees spokespeople from emergency management service and other services talking very confidently about the plans they have to manage the disasters. They've been training for this. The notice comes and it's time to evacuate. She gets Ollie dressed in warm clothes and sturdy shoes and explains very calmly to them what's going to happen. And they evacuate. They're safe. They've done everything they've been asked to do and it's gone according to plan. But is any of that going to help them with what's going to come next? Let's come back to Jane and Ollie in a bit. Jane has done a really good job at doing everything she's been asked to do. She's followed all of the instructions and she's ready to survive that first 72 hours. That type of preparedness is really important, but it's only one piece in a very large puzzle. Disasters, they have a lot of impacts. We're not very good at talking about the impacts of disasters yet, not as good as we are at talking about that initial preparedness. Now, let's back up for a second. Let's be really clear about what a disaster is. Disasters aren't the existence of fires, floods, storms, cyclones. They're hazards. Disasters are what happens when those hazards intersect with populations and they cause harm. The most simple explanation I've ever seen of this comes from a textbook that was written about 20 years ago. In that textbook, they use this example. This is the Sherman landslide in Alaska. In 1964, about 29 million cubic metres of rock and ice hurtled down a hill at about 180 kilometres an hour. As far as landslides go, it was enormous. It was epic, a really big landslide. But no one noticed until a routine flight went overhead and someone took a picture. The valley was uninhabited. They then compare it with a much smaller landslide, about 200 times smaller, and a much slower landslide, about 30 times slower landslide that happened in 1966. Except that that landslide happened in a mining town in Wales, a town called Aberfan. That mining landslide killed 144 people, including 116 children, when it destroyed 18 homes, the primary school, and the local high school. The consequences were devastating. So disasters aren't that existence of fires, floods, storms, cyclones. They're what happens when they intersect the population and they cause harm. Disasters have consequences. We're not very good at planning for those bits just yet. One of the things about the dramatic increase in disasters that we've had over the last couple of decades is that we have much better information about the impacts that they have on people and communities. We have good evidence showing us that disasters impact every part of people's lives: their health, their relationships, their education, their livelihoods, their homes, their communities. We also have really good evidence, both from here in Australia and globally, that these impacts, they take a really long time to recover from. These types of disruptions and impacts, recovery from them is measured in years and decades, not weeks or months. But we plan for days. Let's be really conservative for a moment. Let's say that we thought a disaster would take 5 years to recover from. If we had done all of the work that Jane and Ollie had done to prepare, and let's be clear, most of us don't or can't do what Jane has done. But let's say that we had done that work, we were ready, and we were prepared for that first week. It would look something like this. That means that we're not planning for any of this. The stuff that we need to prepare for this bit, that's not going to fit in the bag. And the kicker is that most of the preparedness information that's out there at the moment, that targets individuals and households, people like Jane and Ollie. The reality is there's only so much individuals can do to prepare for these really large long-term disruptions. What we need is the systems around us to be prepared for this. Systems like our health systems, our education systems, our housing systems, our legal systems. We need them to be ready not just to get through that first 72 hours, but for the years of disruption that are going to be happening. I think that there is a way that we can radically, meaningfully change the way that we think about disaster preparedness. It doesn't require us to have any more machines or fancy equipment. It requires us to finish our sentences. If we can finish the sentence, we are preparing for, and not finish that sentence with a word like fire or flood, but if we can finish it with consequence words, things like, we are preparing for high levels of housing disruption. We are preparing for health complications after disasters. We are preparing for increased family violence after disasters. We are preparing for disruption to education after disasters. If we can finish those sentences, our plans become meaningful. We are preparing for what? Because if we don't finish those sentences, we don't know what we're aiming for. Now let's go back to Jane and Ollie. It's been a couple of weeks since that disaster's gone through their town, that fire or their flood. Their home has been damaged. It's still standing, but it's going to need repairs, and Jane doesn't think that it's safe to stay in there right now, so they're staying with a friend. Jane knows that she's really lucky. A lot of people in their community lost their homes altogether. The school's suffered some damage. It's okay, but there's work to be done. But then things, well, they sort of start to get weird. The emergency services are mostly gone now. Their job's pretty much done. If this was a disaster movie, the credits would have rolled a long time ago. Jane goes and catches up with a friend of hers who's the GP in the local area. She's really stressed out. She's been reading all this research that shows that there's a real likelihood to be a real increase in health complications in the months and years after disasters, but she can't find any screening tools to use. And Jane says, "Is there a plan for this?" Her friend says, "She doesn't know." She'd followed all the information that was available to GP clinics, but that was really around getting through a fire, a flood or a storm, or what would happen if the clinic was without power for 72 hours or so. Jane has to lodge an application with her insurance company to have a claim to get the repairs done, and she does that. They come back to her reasonably quickly with a lump sum settlement that they wanted to sign off on. But Jane doesn't know how much her house costs to repair, and there's also word that maybe the building codes will change. No one's really too sure at the moment. There's a lot of pressure on Jane, it feels like, to take that settlement quite quickly, but she's resourceful and she's good at getting information. So she goes down to the recovery centre that's been set up by the new government recovery department, and she asks for some information. She says she's pretty sure that this is pretty common after disasters. She needs some help about what to do with the rebuild, how much people think it's going to cost, what normally happens, and also what her options are for temporary accommodation while these repairs are happening. The woman who's working there says, no, actually repairs are Jane's problem. She's going to have to negotiate just directly with the insurance company, and there isn't a plan for temporary accommodation for people like her. People who have lost their homes altogether, well, they might be able to apply for something, but no, there's no plan for that. And Jane says, why isn't there a plan for that? And the woman who's working there says, actually, this is the first disaster that she's ever worked on, but there is a recovery plan being made by the state government and the local government. It'll be a few months until it comes out, though. Jane should probably just be grateful that she has a home at all. As president of the PTA, Jane goes and talks to the principal. The principal tells her, well, it's a bit of a mess at the moment. About half the kids are going to be displaced for at least 6 months, and they're going to be down a minimum of 8 teachers, people who have lost their homes or their rental leases and have had to move out of the area. The Department of Education has come by and they've done an assessment on the building, and they've told the principal it should just be pretty much business as usual. She should get back to making sure that curriculum's being taught. They can probably offer some counsellors and maybe some relief staff in the short term, but things should just go on. And Jane says, why isn't there a plan for this? And the principal says she doesn't know. The school's emergency plan was up to date, but it was around getting through a fire, a flood or a storm, or what would have to happen if they had to evacuate all the kids in a disaster. It wasn't about any of this. They hadn't been instructed to do that. They'd been instructed to plan for that short term. The Department of Education says, yeah, sure, they do have plans to make sure the buildings are safe and to make sure they do an after-action review, whatever that is. Jane goes to an information session that's being run by this new recovery department, this government department, and it's about helping kids to recover. In it, one of the speakers talks about how there's real likelihood that there'll be disruption to kids' education, so it's really important that there are some support services around them to make sure that doesn't happen. And Jane says, well, can she get a copy of the plan for these support services? And the person there says, they're really sorry, it's their first week, they're not sure what the plan is, they don't actually know that there is a plan, there might be some counselling available, they're really sorry. Jane is baffled. I've met hundreds of Janes and Ollies. I think Jane can be forgiven for thinking that this is weird. It is weird. It's weird that we know disasters have all of these impacts and long-term consequences, and we still just focus on surviving that 72 hours. That's important, but it's one piece of a much bigger story. There's no workforce pathway for this at the moment either. You can be a little kid who wants to be a firefighter when they grow up, and there's a pathway for you. You can't be a little kid who wants to be a recovery worker. We employ them after the thing has happened, usually on short-term contracts, and then we figure out how to train them. This isn't information that's embedded in other jobs at the moment either. You're not likely to hear about what the long-term impacts of disasters are if you're training to be a doctor or a lawyer or a builder or a teacher or a social worker, even though we know all of those jobs are going to be involved in disaster recovery and have a really important role. When I say there is good evidence showing that every part of people's lives will be affected by a disaster, their health, their relationships, their educations, their livelihoods, their homes, their communities. I mean just that. There is good evidence showing that. If you were someone who had a responsibility for making sure things were prepared for disasters 30 years ago, you could be forgiven for not understanding the scope of what these impacts are, but not anymore. The information is there. There are going to be hundreds more disasters, thousands more Janes and Ollies. Yes, we are doing a good job at making sure they have information to survive that hazard, but what about the disaster? Are we prepared for Jane and Ollie to live in a safe home after something's happened? Are we preparing for Ollie to finish their education? Are we preparing for any of those other impacts that we know are going to affect them and disrupt them for the months and years and decades to come? What are we preparing for? Until we finish those sentences, we're going to keep missing the mark. Thank you.